The content of this podcast is based on medical fact and evidence-based practice from credible authoritative sources, but is not a substitute for your institution's policies, procedures, common sense, or good judgment. The views and opinions are those of Eric Bauer and FlightBridgeED in their entirety. This is the FlightBridgeED Podcast, critical care and emergency medicine education for nurses and paramedics. Here's your host, Eric Bauer.
Hey everybody, Eric back with you. This morning I want to go over a quick kind of podcast on a topic that I think is so important in our industry, in pre-hospital medicine specifically, but really in all medicine. And it really still blows my mind when you go into a facility, you go into a hospital, and they're still putting a colorimetric device on an ET tube for confirmation. I think pre-hospital medicine, we're way ahead when you compare that to hospital-based innovation. Obviously, you listen to MCRIT, you listen to Scott Weingart. He is a complete 100% advocate for end-tidal CO2 anywhere in the hospital, but I don't think that translates throughout our industry. But that does translate as the gold standard, number one way we confirm ET tube placement and continually monitor that ET tube in transport. But our end-tidal CO2, as we've learned, is so much more than just ET tube confirmation. And last year, just kind of based on my clinical position with my primary job that I'm now PRN, is, we really saw a huge incidence still of chasing that number. If you have a low end-tidal CO2, looking at the charting and watching, the minute ventilation being changed by the crew and not evaluating kind of the big picture. And so I came up with a concept called the 3 Ps of end-tidal CO2, kind of ran that by a colleague of mine. He loved it. And so we started teaching that. And I touch on this in the review classes. So if you've never taken one of our review classes, you may not have heard this, or I've touched on this real briefly in a few other podcasts. So let's kind of hit this real quick. And I think this is something that we need to always kind of consider and apply on any patient. So the 3 Ps of end-tidal CO2 kind of give you an idea of what we're talking about. Let's say you have a patient on the mechanical ventilator. You intubate them, you place your end-tidal CO2 waveform capnography on the patient, on the ET tube. You're ventilating the patient, and your initial number is 22. What does that mean? Well, again, if we go back to how we were originally taught, including myself, we were taught that a number between 35 and 45 is our goal, right? And I say goal, and I think that is the mistake right there, is we revert back to how we were originally taught. And the goal is based on normal perfusion. We have to remember end-tidal CO2 is the gold standard also for identifying perfusion and perfusion changes. Our medical director, Dan Davis, he's been looking at all this data, and he's identified if your end-tidal CO2 drops to 25 and you have a corresponding systolic blood pressure of 80 in that trauma patient, that's an impending arrest situation. That's how powerful that is. I've seen patients simply start decreasing their end-tidal CO2. Nothing else is changing, but simply that drop in end-tidal CO2. And after you've seen it a few times, you can almost call if your patient is about to arrest. So we have to be very, very careful when we look at end-tidal CO2 and we see this patient that we've intubated successfully, we've placed that end-tidal CO2 on them, and we're getting that number 22. We can't automatically think, oh man, we've been bagging too fast. We've got to slow down the minute ventilation. So I want you to take these 3 pearls with you. The 3 Ps of end-tidal CO2. Number 1, do they have a perfusing pulse? Very, very easy for a patient to go into a PEA arrest and be slow to identify it. If that's in between blood pressure changes, you're in an aircraft, you're flying along, it's nighttime, it's very, very easy. And I guarantee that we possibly could miss this. The only way you're going to see this is if you see a big significant drop in the end-tidal CO2. But if it's already low, then you may not notice it right away. So always check a pulse. Make sure you have a perfusing pulse. That's just a simple rule out. Number 2, the second P, is what's the perfusion status? If you look at the waveform on an end-tidal CO2 strip, that waveform is measured based on gas exchange, and that gas exchange is completely reliant on our cardiac output. We deliver oxygen. We have gas exchange based on two things. We deliver a gas, right, to our alveoli. It diffuses through our capillaries or through our alveolar membrane into our capillaries, and we then have to transport those gases to where they need to go. If we have no cardiac output, your measurement is going to be low. It's going to be slow to respond. So number 2 is what's the perfusion status? If you have a low end-tidal CO2, you have a perfusing pulse, but your blood pressure is low or your MAP is less than 65, then that explains why that end-tidal CO2 is low. And that means we're not going to chase that number. We're going to fix the perfusion status. Number 3, what's the pH? I've talked about this on other podcasts when I went through the acidosis rodeo part 1, 2, and 3. We know that as the pH starts dropping, and really we need to apply this to these really severe metabolic acidosis patients. So specifically DKA is going to be one that we're going to see most often. But these are pHs that are less than 7. A lot of these patients will be in a partially compensated metabolic acidosis. And so that means they have an underlying respiratory alkalosis. Our second line of defense, our buffering system on the respiratory side, is kind of kicking in, and we're trying to blow off CO2. CO2 is an acid, and so our patients are attempting to blow off CO2 to maintain a pH at where it's at. So if we go through, we identify we have a pulse, we identify, hey, our perfusion status is lousy. We need to fix that. So we need to give volume. We may need to give blood. We may need to start a pressor. And then we get to our pH and we identify, hey, this pH is probably low. Well, what if we don't have a blood gas? Well, we can do an anion gap calculation. Remember, we can do a calculated or corrected anion gap calculation utilizing our chloride, using our CO2, which is really our bicarb on our Chem 7 panel, and our sodium and our potassium, all those together. So you're going to take your chloride plus your CO2 on your Chem 7. You're going to add those together. You're going to subtract that from your sodium and then add your potassium to it. And if we're greater than 20, we're very probable in saying, hey, this patient is in a metabolic acidosis. We can also do a calculated base deficit. We take the number 24, that number is a fixed number, and we subtract the CO2 off the Chem 7. If our CO2 on the Chem 7, for example, is 15, subtract that from 24, that means we have a base deficit of 9 or a base excess of -9. So that's telling you that they're in a metabolic acidosis. So there's lots of little clues we can kind of grab onto just based on normal labs that will tell us if our patient is in a metabolic acidosis. Again, you're not going to see these tachypnic patients until they get very, very severe. And those are actually very, very few in comparison to, the standard metabolic acidosis. So I go through the 3 Ps of end-tidal CO2, and if I can say that one of those is in play, you don't touch that number. You leave that number there. If the perfusion status is the problem, you fix the perfusion status, and that end-tidal CO2 should come up. If the pH is the problem, well, then they're compensating. If they're compensating to the point where they're blowing off that much CO2, then we need to maintain that compensation. The real risk is not looking at those 3 key things and chasing that number, saying, hey, that end-tidal CO2 is 22. Man, we're breathing too fast. Lower that minute ventilation down. Let's say it is a compensation for a severe DKA patient. Well, you're very likely going to kill your patient. So just remember that end-tidal CO2 is your friend. Utilize it in any patient you can. Even if they're not intubated, put a nasal cannula on. You can identify respiratory status. You can make good clinical decisions based on respiratory failure. If that end-tidal CO2 is greater than 50, we know that the PaCO2 has got to be greater than that, right? And that is a definition of respiratory failure. And so we really can learn a lot from our Entitled CO2. It's not just a tool for ET2 placement confirmation and continuous monitoring. So remember these 3 pearls. If you're coming to AMTC, I'll be at AMTC. I'm speaking on the Monday, I believe the 16th. So come and check that out. And then I will be traveling right back to Las Vegas for EMS World. So I'll be in Las Vegas actually the weekend before AMTC, 13th, 14th, and 15th for a review class there. Head to AMTC, and then I'll come back to EMS World, and we'll have a booth there. So come check us out. Come meet us. I'd love to meet you if I haven't met you already. And if you have any questions, you have any comments or any ideas for podcasts, please shoot them my way. And until next time, I'll talk to you soon.
This has been a production of the FlightBridgeED Podcast, leading the way in pre-hospital critical care and emergency medicine education.